Hi there, I'm Sunnivi Bridham, Digital Managing Editor at Free Speech TV, and I am thrilled to be here today with actor, director, writer, and friend of Free Speech TV, Emilio Estevez.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. Finally, you know, I tried to find your offices a couple years ago. I wanted to make an in-person donation, and I was driving from Los Angeles to Cincinnati, as I do,
right, of course.
as one does.
Right.
And so I said, well, I'm going to stop in Denver. I'm going to find the offices, and I'm going to do this in-person donation. And I couldn't find you, and no one was picking up the phone. So I left a couple of messages, but I think I was able to finally do it either online or. But yes, so here I am. It only took me 4 years to find you.
Well,
but here I am.
We're so glad you're here, and thank you
thrilled.
for the donation. Thank you for your support.
Thank you.
And you're touring right now your new film called The Public, which releases April 4th, you said?
April 5th.
April 5th.
Friday, April 5th. We're going to go out in about, I think, 30 to 50 markets. And then we're expanding beyond that. So it's what's called a platform release. So it'll be a slower rollout, and in success, they'll keep adding theaters and play dates.
And you mentioned that you were driving from Cincinnati. You actually moved there from Los Angeles to work on the film as well, right?
Yeah. So I sold my house in LA with all of the furnishings. I packed up my car with 2 suitcases, pretty much. I have a little storage facility for books and photos, but for the most part, I distilled my life down to 2 bags. I drove from LA to Cincy to start prep on the film, and I'm kind of been living on the road for the last 2.5 years. Hotels, folks' couch, my kids' couches. I've been sort of flopping how as and when, but it's been kind of liberating for the most part. The building that I purchased in Cincinnati is an old building built in 1881. So it's got great guts, but it still needs some work. So I'm in the process of working on it. And
how exciting!
Yeah.
So in addition to escaping the rat race, I know that I believe in a prior interview you had mentioned that you started really working on production of this film right after the 2016 election.
Well, yes, exactly.
But it's been on your mind for a lot longer than that,
I
right?
I started this process 12 years ago. It was originally inspired by an article in the LA Times called Written Off. It was written by a Salt Lake City librarian named Chip Ward, who was retiring. And the thesis of his essay was, libraries have become de facto homeless shelters, and librarians have become first responders and social workers de facto. This was not just something that was happening in the Salt Lake City library, but it was clearly an epidemic, that every urban library in the country was experiencing the same issues. I was really moved by the piece, and I started to do the research, and I said, I think this is potentially my next film. Now, getting back in the library after 30 years was something that was, you know, making a film in the library and connecting it to the Breakfast Club, I thought was something that was clever,
yes,
right? But as I started to do a deeper dive into what was happening, I created this narrative drama about what would happen if the occupants of the library, the patrons, decided to occupy. Since they are de facto homeless shelter anyway, what does that look like? And what would it look like if the media were to spin that out of control, and the police and politicians, which is, you know, we're seeing quite a bit of now.
Exactly.
So anyway, the movie or the script developed. We were in pre-production, cast was coming aboard, crew was coming aboard, and then the crisis of 2008. However, in one way, in many ways actually, I'm grateful, because I think the movie is more relevant now than it would have been had we made it years ago.
Right.
And also too, I do owe a debt of gratitude to Free Speech TV, because while I was in that limbo place of the old script and being, you know, and bringing the story up to date, I started watching Free Speech TV.
Really?
I started being exposed to, you know, great critical thinkers, and the shows that were, you know, popular. Laura Flanders' show, she'd have Dr. West and Richard Wolff on, and all of a sudden I'm exposed to these extraordinary ideas and some pretty radical thinkers as well. Chris Hedges is another one who I think is just, yeah, his new book, America the Farewell Tour is just as inspiring as it is painful and heartbreaking. So I really owe a debt of gratitude to Free Speech TV for inspiring and really pushing the narrative forward in that creating it so that I would create a story, so I could create a story that was more inclusive, more about the intersectionality. I think is what is something that I think is when you think about public libraries, and when you think about the intersectionality that exists inside the pub from the climate. Right. It's not climate change. It's climate. We're in a climate crisis, as Bill McKibben likes to say. We need to change our attitude, and we have to say yes. We're in a homelessness crisis. We're in an opioid addiction crisis. And I think we need to start calling things exactly for what they are. But that the library is that place where all of these issues intersect. Yes. I thought was pretty right on and pretty, you know, I thought that to be able to build a film around that and also make it entertaining and not make it this, you know, didactic bludgeoning of information, but rather, you know, frame it in a way that is entertaining. That was the real trick here. Yeah, well, of course. Because it's very funny. I'm sorry. Right. Yeah. No, of course. And so the narrative itself is fictional, but clearly it's based in these intersections that you're talking about, right? That's right. Touches on climate change, homelessness, addiction, militarization of police, who the media is really working for. That's right. Did I get the big ones? Oh yeah. Okay. Oh yeah. So I'm wondering, you know, whether creating the film and particularly creating the film at this moment in history provided any kind of catharsis or inspiration for you throughout the process? Well, I would say this, you know, in the 80s and the early 90s, I would, you know, my father's been arrested 66 times for civil disobedience, and the issues that he was arrested for was immigration, anti-nuclear rallies, and homelessness issues. And you know, we're still working on all three. Yes. But I would watch him get arrested on television, and sometimes sitting next to my mom and thinking, my God, you know, what is he doing? And he'd be taken off in handcuffs and loaded into a paddy wagon or a bus, and usually reciting the Lord's Prayer, and he looked like a lunatic. And so I was like, man, what is he doing? He's ruining his career. This is something that's not going to track well, and it's going to. He's stepping on some third rail issues here, and the studios and the people in our industry are going to be afraid of him. So but I understood what he was doing fundamentally, and I didn't really understand what he was doing spiritually until I started working on this film. That he could not do that. He could not say. He could not stay silent. He had to speak up. And he is a man who he walks the walk. He lives by his convictions. And you know, early days when we were talking about going to war in Iraq, he stood up and he said, there are no WMD. And there were some corporations involved in his business life that asked him to be quiet. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. This is silly. This is folly. And it's too important to stay quiet, right? Indeed. So you mentioned, of course, Breakfast Club, right? So it seems like whether you're dancing on the stacks in high school detention or aligning your character, with homeless folks who have occupied a library so that they don't literally freeze to death. It seems like libraries have been an important part not only of your career, but is it fair to say of your personal life too? You've spoken in other interviews about the time you've spent in libraries, how they're kind of sacred spaces for you. Definitely sacred spaces for me, and they were also a place where I could go and disappear in the stacks. Libraries were that really encouraged my curiosity. Now with Google and with Amazon and with all of these the new technology at our fingertips, I think what happens is, okay, we now expect information to happen instantly. When I was younger, much younger, when you were looking up a word in the dictionary, you'd go page by page and you'd stop along the way, and it may take you an hour to get to that word, and along the way, your curiosity was piqued, and you learned not just the word that you were looking for, the meaning of, but all the others along the way. Same with encyclopedia, looking up one specific subject, and boom, there you are spending time. That's gone.
Yes.
For young people today. So I would encourage young people to recapture that curiosity that I think that we've, by looking down like this at our mobile devices, we're no longer looking up. We're no longer a tourist in the world.
That's very true.
And I think that that we're missing a lot. It's another reason why I like driving.
Right.
You miss a lot at 30,000 feet. You get to see a lot of this country, and I love America. It's so extraordinary. You spend time driving through little towns and through cities that you normally, if you're flying coast to coast, you miss it. The farmers market in Omaha is extraordinary. Spend some time along the border in Presidio, Texas. Lawrence, Kansas is an extraordinary college town, and great Main Street there. I mean, so I'm once you get out of the 310 and the 212, there is a lot going on. It's not the flyover states, it's the United States that I'm very proud to be a citizen of. And I think those trips and digging in to some of these cities and towns along the way also helped inform this film.
When you spoke a little bit about the value of libraries, and even in our digital world, right? They still provide shelter, they provide information, they are by nature, I would argue, actually pretty radical spaces.
Sure.
And I think librarians have a reputation for being very staid and just shushing everyone. Most librarians I know got into the field because they wanted to empower people. They wanted to help create change.
That's right.
So, I wonder, the library feels like one of the few public spaces that's truly still public, that still exists.
That's free
so I
for
wonder kind of exactly,
Yeah.
how do you feel about the threats facing those kind of final public? Yes, exactly.
Of the public spaces. I mean, I think that every public space is under threat of privatization. There's a new book called Palaces for the People, written by Eric Kleinenberg, and I just started reading. It was gifted to me at the ALA conference, the Midwinter Conference in Seattle. So I just cracked it last week. But he talks about specifically a phrase that he coined called social infrastructure, and that the libraries are the cornerstone of that social infrastructure. It is a place where people from all walks of life can be sitting next to each other, working together, and in a common space. So how do we know what's going on in the rest of our community if we're not exposed to the people who live in that community? And the library offers that. There's another interesting fact too, is that millennials are going back to the library. So that's actually, I'm happy about that, because there's, especially among young people, there's the fact that the library is being rediscovered gives me hope that they will not be privatized anytime soon.
Right, it's in-person social networking. What a concept.
I just got my passport renewed at the public library.
Really?
So again, they offer so many services that there used to be a HUD kiosk in the downtown branch of the LAPL. You could go and look for housing, job searching, telling your loved ones and your family that you're still alive, right? So when you think about the digital age and what the tech that we have available to us, and that's sort of the great class divide. Not everybody has access to it. We sort of take that for granted. So if you are in the library and you have 2 hours of time allocated to that computer that you're on, you have 2 hours to look for a job, write your family, catch up on the news, whatever it is, and that's a huge difference between having those 2 hours versus having the access all day long.
And so as we look at the threat of privatization, certainly we've seen that at big government levels. We've seen that at local levels. Right. Here at Free Speech TV, we strive to be people-powered to focus on solutions.
That's right.
So I wonder, kind of what, if you've in traversing the country, if you've seen localities, organizers that are really doing work to help defend some of those public spaces and that social infrastructure you spoke about.
I have. I've actually been very fortunate to bump into and talk to a lot of individuals who are very committed, who truly want to save the planet and change the world. The takeaway that I get from a lot of the travels and meeting these folks is that there is a sense among the progressive movement that it's very fractured, and that everybody's sort of fighting for their crumb, their piece.
Is that scarcity mindset?
That's the scarcity mindset, which is why I love the Poor People's Campaign so much, because Reverend Barber's talking about, listen, we're all fighting for the same goals, and if we can coalesce together, rather than be all this fractured different pieces of the same puzzle, we can bring it together, create a tapestry that speaks across all lines, and work as a unified force. And I think that is what we're seeing happen. It's going to take some time, but we got to get out of that scarcity mentality. We got to get on the same page, or we're going to find ourselves in a very similar situation that we did in 2016 come the next election cycle.
So given those kind of dire straits and high stakes, what do you find that gives you hope these days? Do you have hope?
I do. I am not an optimist, but and I've heard well, it's Dr. King. His quote is he was a prisoner of hope. So I'm a prisoner of hope. And I think that that we ultimately, the better angels of our nature will win out. I think that we are inherently good and decent people, and when this country wants to band together and do something, we do it. We get it done. I don't think we can have, and this is just my own personal opinion, I don't think we can have conversations about universal health care until we talk about universal housing. Right now, there are only 3 states that offer shelter, which is, what I mean by shelter is, it's a right to shelter. It's Massachusetts, New York, and DC. So how do we get other states to follow that model, right to shelter? But shelter's not enough. We got to get to permanent supportive housing. When you start looking at the numbers of what it costs to, through emergency services or EA, emergency assistance, to provide for somebody who's on the street, it's $68,000 a year. You put a roof over that same person's head, it goes down to 15 grand. We pay that either way.
Right.
So let's figure out a way to get to universal housing. Let's get roofs over these individuals' heads, and now we can start treating what ails them.
Absolutely.
So,
and supporting their families and providing those resources that folks need to really, to fight for themselves.
That's right.
I think this myth that homeless folks are lazy or that it is some kind of moral failing is something that we have been convinced of as a society.
Well, that's our bias. We don't check our bias at the door when we see somebody on the street.
Exactly.
We assign a story to them.
Exactly.
So we got to get past. We got to check the bias at the door and say, this is an individual. This is my brother, my sister, who needs help.
And to realize that many of us are closer to that than we think.
Oh yeah.
I think the shutdown demonstrated that, right? There
Indeed.
are millions of Americans who are one paycheck away.
That's right.
From homelessness.
That's right.
So I think that your film helps to illuminate some of that and really draw those intersectional connections and help us realize that we all contain multitudes and we are all part of one.
That's right.
One big piece.
And it does it in an entertaining way.
Yes.
Again, it does it it uses humor, because I think that's sort of the great, humor is the great disarmor, right? It forces you to look at a situation, at the absurdity of it, and tap into your own humanity and using humor to do that, I think is so important.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time today, for the work you're doing, and for the change you are continuing to make in the world. Thank you for being here.
Thank you to Free Speech TV for being an outlet and for being a voice of reason and sanity in an unreasonable and insane world. And my hat's off to you. I'm just so happy and proud to be here and thrilled. So thanks for taking the time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's great to meet you.
Thank you.